Welcome to the By Way of Commandment podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the finer points of his doctrine. Join us as we study the gospel through the scriptures and standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You talk a great deal about self-deception in some of your books and stuff, and this is a topic that quite interests me in that I have noticed, even in my own life, certain aspects of myself that I want to hide, that I want to avoid confronting. And I think that's the same for everybody. We all have things about ourselves that we aren't particularly proud of or don't want on display.
Right.
And this is really cutting to the heart of the Adam and Eve story, where they hide themselves after partaking of the fruit. And there's something very I'm drawing a blank on exactly how I want to term this, but there's something that is incredibly freeing in studying this idea of self-deception, because it opens up an avenue where you can think a little bit more intellectually about not just the concept of self-deception, but now you can actually see ways in which you engage in self-deception as well that can be freeing.
Yeah. I recommend the works of the Harbinger Institute. I had a couple of classes from Terry Warner, who specialized in self-deception theory. And in my second volume, I address self-deception in particular from the way that the various works accepted as scripture address self-deception. Paul sees self-deception is at the very core of the challenge of every human being. Okay, it's the very core. It is the problem, this kind of self-deception, because we hide ourselves from our own hearts. James believes that the real problem with Christians and the way that we interact with people is self-deception. We pretend to be Christians when we're truly not. Self-deception is at the very heart of the way that Christ was dealing with the Pharisees. The real problem they have is self-deception. Okay, so and the problem with self-deception is that we're so darn good at it. Okay, we get a lot of practice, and this life is set up so that we're all going to engage in a kind of self-deception. We're going to be like horror. Our lies are so good that we're going to believe them ourselves. And you get the ultimate lesson in self-deception from the story of Korihor in the Book of Mormon, where he's exposed and he says, I knew all along there was a God. I just preached that there wasn't because I was so good at it. And so self-deception is something that is extremely important in the Christian and Jewish and Islamic religious traditions. And when we get right down to it, the only way to overcome self-deception is to be willing to be vulnerable and open and to take accountability. The works of the Harbinger Institute, I think in particular, work at the real interpersonal cost that people pay for self-deception. But at the end of the day, the person that's most deceived by our self-deception is ourselves. And that's what makes it so difficult to deal with. And the ultimate question is always, what prices are people having to pay to be in relationship with me? Because it's the people I say I love the most that are paying the highest price. Why am I exacting the highest price from the people I love the most? And those are the kind of things that as human beings we deal with. And this, I've written about it in my books. It's kind of at the core, asking this question: what is the price that I'm exacting from people that I say I love the most? And how am I interacting in a way, and how am I acting in a way with respect to them? And it's at the core of Christianity. It's at the core of not being, and the writers of the Gospels may have been too tough on the Pharisees and not accepting enough of where they were coming from, to be honest with you. Maybe they're anti-Semitic in some sense. But there's a lot to learn from that discussion and the way that interaction occurs, because there's more than enough pride to go around. It's not limited to Pharisees, I can guarantee you. And there's more than enough pride in academic circles. In fact, my observation is that academia is really good at instilling pride in people in such a way that they become experts at self-deception. And they don't even realize it. They're just really good at self-deception. And they're involved thinking that they can deceive others. And the problem about our self-deception is everybody sees through it but us. So, you know, at the end of the day, we really can't hide. And that's getting back to the story in Eden. What is the most self-defeating activity in human life? Thinking we can hide who we really are from God. Which is what Adam and Eve are doing, right?
Right.
But we engage in this all the time, thinking that we can hide who we really are, and especially thinking we can hide it from God. And that's the great thing about God. It's like Huck Finn said, you can't pray a lie. We're totally exposed, and in our nakedness, we're totally exposed before God for who we really are. And that's why prayer and the activity of presenting ourselves before God honestly and without any covering at all is so healing and revealing, and such the most authentic human act we can do. We go honestly before God and let him expose us to ourselves. I can tell you some of the greatest castigations I've had have come directly from God, and they're tough to go through. I mean, this kind of growth is really, really hard because we're taking on ourselves, and that's the hardest person on earth to take on. And so at the end of the day, what really matters is love. And I think we show love best by being with people and letting them in an encounter where we allow them to reveal themselves to us in that kind of relationship where we truly revel in the other person and we become the person that we are because we're in that relationship. And so that's kind of where I focused my works and writing, because that's what I think is most valuable.
To go back to Eden for a second, as I've studied the various creation accounts and the story of Adam and Eve, there's several things that have stood out to me over the years that are particularly insightful, at least in my opinion. And one of these has to do with this idea of self-deception and being honest with ourselves and with God. And this comes in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are placed in the garden and are, for all intents and purposes, innocent, childlike.
They are, yeah.
And they are also simultaneously naked. There's no hiding. They are completely exposed to themselves and to God in this relationship. And they're also able to converse with God face to face in the garden. Mm-hmm. It's only once they partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that they come to realize their nakedness and they decide to hide themselves. There's something more that I think could be missing from this story, but we have this idea that they partake of the fruit, they discover their nakedness, and they hide themselves from God. They fashion some clothing out of fig leaves and whatnot to hide themselves from their nakedness. And yet at the same time, God sees them for who they are and knows them intimately and in the most honest and intimate way. They can't truly hide themselves from God nor from themselves, despite how much they might wish they can by covering themselves up.
And there's, the text is very instructive, because when they hide themselves, it's not because they've decided not enough. They're told they're not good enough, essentially. You're naked, you better hide. They've been running around without a stitch on throughout the entire story, and all of a sudden they're not good enough, okay? Just the way they are. But it's Satan who's the one who gives them the clue they're not good enough, just the way they are. And it's not really they themselves who fashion their own clothes. God makes this covering for them. He honors their choice to hide. And I see this as a kind of act of charity on God's part. It's like, you want to hide from me? All right, let me kind of help you out here so that you can cover up. because I see that you're uncomfortable in my presence, that kind of a thing. And so there are so many layers to this Adamic story, but the bottom line is that we're attempting to hide who we are from the one person that we can't hide who we are from, right? And he's responding, in reciprocity with this kindness, honoring every decision that we make. If we want to hide, he'll honor that decision. But the bottom line is this kind of self-loathing starts when we decide that we're going to see ourselves through someone else's eyes. That's why I brought up this logically impossible task of seeing ourselves through somebody else's eyes, because we can't do it. It's logically impossible, if anything ever was. But we begin to take our cues from who we are, and how we ought to be from other people and not from ourselves. We begin to want to appear to be a certain way to others. Scholars are really good at this, by the way. They want to appear to be objective and totally dispassionate in such a way that they really don't care what they're talking about. They're just being scholars and presenting the truth. That's not the truth. It's never the truth. Okay. They're always human beings addressing this particular subject matter for a particular reason. And they can do their best to be objective, and we ought to try to do that. We ought to do our best, as I said, to see things from other perspectives and account for that. But at the end of the day, they're going to go home and they're going to have to eat, and they're going to have people in their lives that they love and that they interact with. And they care about the issue that they're talking about for a particular reason, that, they didn't engage other subject matters that they could. And so at the end of the day, if we hide who we are by pretending, I don't have any religious belief, I'm just being objective, that's a lie. That's not who I am, and it's not how I work. And I couldn't. It would be a lie to you to say, I'm just so completely objective. I'm just presenting to you the unvarnished truth, because nobody's capable of that. But we are capable of being honest to the extent of saying, look, this is how I feel. This is where I'm coming from. I have an interest in this subject matter because of this. It matters deeply to me, and that's why I'm addressing it. This is an emotional issue for me because I care about it a great deal. And, that may show through at points. I'm going to do my best to control for that, but I'm probably not going to be very successful. It's going to color how I see things and what I'm capable of seeing, actually. So that's the way scholarship actually proceeds. This air of objectivity and not being, a real human being, that's a facade.
And it's no coincidence in my mind that when we think about the temple experience as a Latter-day Saint, the backdrop is it all takes place in the setting of creation and with Adam and Eve and the things that they went through, and how we are to view ourselves respectively in their place through this story. Right. And it is no coincidence that we are to view ourselves in like manner, and the laws, the teaching that we are supposed to take away from this directly attacks this self-deception and pride that we have in ourselves, as we are asked to participate in the laws of sacrifice and consecration. You right. cannot do that. You cannot partake in a truly honest and loving relationship with God and man if you are not willing to sacrifice of those things that are not in line with true gospel principles, and if you're not willing to give of yourself entirely to God and your spouse and your family first.
And we can't hold anything back. It's like it's what happens in American medicine, where if you have a son or a daughter or a wife, somebody in your family who's dying, you take everything you've got and you spend it all to take care of them, because nothing you've got is as valuable as the people that you're dealing with. That's at the bottom of the day. You find out what really matters when you find out what people are willing to give up for it. Okay. It's kind of what's behind the story of Abraham and Isaac when you get right down to it. What are you willing to give up in order to have this relationship or to be with me? And God is demanding everything, nothing withheld, and nothing else will do. He wants our entire soul. He doesn't want just our heads. Least of all, he wants our heads, I should say. He wants our hearts. He wants everything about us. And so, what you learned, the revelation that you had, that it involves all of us. That's what the lesson of self-deception is really about. We can't hide and pretend that we're something less than what realistically, holistically we are. And so, in doing scholarship, this kind of vulnerability and honesty with those that we interact with through our writings, I think, is really very essential. Um, Unfortunately, it means that in the way that things go today, people will just say, "Well, if you're a Mormon, I don't care what you've got to say. You're too biased." Or if you're an evangelical, I don't count your scholarship because you're an evangelical. Or if you're an atheist, it's like, well, why should I take you seriously? Or, God forbid, you're a Republican. Oh my gosh, can't listen to anything you say. Or if you're a Democrat, that kind of excludes everybody when you get right down to it, right? We can exclude everybody because they all come from a point of view.
Well, and now once you do that, we're all in our own little box with an N of one. And now we are essentially our own God because we are the only authority on what we're allowed to believe and exude.
Yeah, and that's called solipsism. And the reality is that no person is an island. The truth is that we all came into life through the life of another human being, that we couldn't survive without other human beings, and that we tend to thrive as individuals and persons by being in fulfilling, meaningful relationships with others. And so the reality of our human lives is that we're never this solipsistic, man all alone on an island, objectively true. That's just not the case.
Yeah, that is the self-deception.
Yep, that is the self-deception. Is the self-deception built into scholarship when you get right down to it?
Yeah, and I see how the what we're supposed to be learning from our experience as Christians, as disciples of Jesus Christ, is to directly oppose this self-deception in our lives and rid ourselves of it in a manner that we can give of ourselves entirely to our Savior, our Heavenly Father, and those who we love.
Yeah. So we work on ourselves to see through our own self-deception. And the only way we can assist others out of their self-deception is to simply love them and accept them just the way they are so that they don't have to hide. Um, they don't need to hide because they're not guilty in our eyes. Okay. And at the end of the day, love is the healing factor, love for others and love for ourselves. That is, I don't need another person's approval because I approve of myself. I don't care about what other persons think because there's only one person who really knows me well enough to really have a way to judge in any way that would be fair and just. I care what that person thinks. And so I'm going to expose myself to that person as much as I can. And so at the end of the day, we're all just human beings. And I suggest that the best thing we can do is to often do a self audit and ask ourselves, what am I doing that's exacting a price of the people that I love? What is my way of being that is costing them to pay a price to be in relationship with me? What is it that is occurring such that I have to be right and make everybody else wrong? Because it's a wonderful thing to be right, but if you're right 100% of the time, everybody who's with you gets to be wrong 100% of the time. That feels rotten. And so maybe it's not about being right or wrong. Maybe it's about being loving and seeing that people are coming from different perspectives, and then to have a respectful dialogue where we learn from each other.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier in our discussion there's a very profound reason why we are placed on this earth in families. That it requires both a father and a mother to bring children into the world, and ideally to raise them as husband and wife, and parents of their children. Because it's, as much as I love my wife, there are things about her that can get on my nerves from time to time, and the same can be true in the other direction. We have a way of seeing things about ourselves that are so wonderful and beautiful that we could, uh, it would be difficult not to see our lives without them. There's also the other side of things that we can learn from one another that we can't learn by ourselves, and our
There are a lot of
children
things we can't learn in any other way.
and our children as well. You mentioned, children and spouse is our greatest teachers.
Right.
Um, and I used to think I was right all the time about so many things, and then I got married and realized that that's not the case. Um, and then you have
Yeah.
children, and you realize that uh, as much as you'd like to be right, even if you are right, your children will still point out all the things that are wrong, but they do it in such a way that is so pure and loving that you can't help but learn from the experience unless you just totally shut yourself out from it.
Yeah. And the great thing with kids is, especially when they're younger, they don't care if you're right or wrong. It's not
I
about being right or wrong. It's about interacting with them in a way. I'll give you an example. When I was younger, I would spank my kids. And then I woke up one day and realized my kids need to look to me for protection, not fear. And so I decided I was no longer going to spank my kids. Now, maybe other people could get away with spanking their kids. I was not very good at it because sometimes I would do it in anger. And so I just stopped spanking. But I did learn to say, to teach my kids, I want you to know that what matters here is trust, and you've lost my trust. And unlike my love, I give you my love unconditionally. I'll love you no matter what. But my trust is earned, and you only get my trust when you show that you're trustworthy. And I'm willing to give you an opportunity to earn my trust, but it requires you acting in a such way that's trustworthy. And so I'm going to give you the chance to be trustworthy. That's up to you. If you don't care about my trust, that's fine, but that's how it actually is. And that was a much better teaching position, I found.
I had a I had an experience with my oldest son, um, which I found to be, oh man, it was probably the most profound experience of my years as a father, even to this point. He was about a year and a half old, and he was into everything. I mean, you could not lock anything tight enough. He would find a way to get into everything, and um, I would get frustrated, very, very frustrated, and to the point of almost anger. If I came home and there's messes all over the place because he got into things, or if I'm looking after him, having little kids, that you can't take your eye off them for more than a second, and they're already doing something that either they're getting into something, making a mess, or they're about to hurt themselves. Um,
That's true.
and I had kind of had it at this point. Um, he had just gotten into so many things, but there's an experience where it was Sunday morning. I'm getting ready for church. He's into everything, and I'm trying to get ready and care for him and keep him out of things, and um, it's just not going well. So I just kind of set him down on the floor with some toys outside the bathroom door and said, "Here, you sit here, you play. I'm gonna go brush my teeth and continue getting ready for church." And I I turned around. I had started brushing my teeth, and I turn around, and he has a little toy um, that he's kind of uh, taken to his face, and he's rubbing his lips with this toy, and he's mirroring everything that I'm doing. Um, and this is probably one of the most spiritual experiences I've had in my life, of looking into the eyes of this little tiny human being that my wife and I brought into this world, and seeing him mimic everything I'm doing. And the spirit whispered to me in a way that was almost audible. Um, but it said, the son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the father do.
Hmm.
And I realized two things in that moment. One, I realized the son is fulfilling the divine pattern the father has set for him and is learning from the father everything that the father has done and is teaching him. And they are in that oneness of relationship with each other, where the son is mimicking and mirroring everything that he sees the father do. That's the first thing. The second thing was, this little boy is looking to me in that same way, with that childlike innocence, looking to his father to teach him everything, um, without any reservation, without any self deception. He's just there in front of me, watching my every move and looking to me for that guidance. And I have the greatest responsibility in the world in being that kind of father that can teach him in only a way that a loving father could. And I have failed every day since to live up to that. Um, but that's been the most profound experience of my life, um, certainly my adult life, and that stuck with me ever since. Um, I can't imagine. I'll say this. This was the first time I think, um, in my life as a father where I truly felt like a father. You have children, you bring them into the world, you go to the hospital when your wife delivers, and you have this little bouncing baby to take home, and it's all wonderful, and it's scary because it's this new life that you're responsible for taking care of, and all of that happens with pretty much everybody. You experience those things, but this was the first real moment where all of that hit me simultaneously in the most profoundly spiritual way.
Thank you for sharing that. That truly is profound. And it shows the power of being in the family relationships as teaching moments and moments that take us way outside our comfort zone. And I've had a similar experience where I realized that my kids were just mimicking everything I did, and they put a special responsibility on me. And I realized that at the end of the day, they didn't come with manuals, and I'm going to screw them up, and they're going to have issues, and it comes with being in families. It's the way things are, and it's okay. God set it up that way on purpose, and we're learning from each other. This is a very loving way of doing things. And there will be those who don't have that experience. My heart goes out to people who can't have children. My heart goes out to people who are not in that kind of relationship where they can experience. I trust that God has other teaching tools and moments and opportunities that work for them to learn what they came here to learn. But I can tell you that being a father and grandfather and husband has been the most profound factors in my life, and have taught me the most, have called me outside of myself the most, and have exposed me to my own self-deception the most. And so, there is something truly divine about this family relationship as a tool for turning us into God. So um, that's how I see it. That's my experience.
There's a number of things that I wish we could talk about. Um, we've gone on for quite some time already.
Well, it's been 2.5 hours, so
Um, well, maybe what we can do is I can have you back on another time. We can talk about some more. Maybe we can get to some of the topics that we had originally planned to
sure,
discuss.
sure.
Um,
At the end of the day, what we talked about was more important anyway. So
I think so as well.
yeah,
I do want to ask, um, kind of completely unrelated topic, and I don't mean to entirely shift gears, but we're talking about things that mean the most to us, and from a theological perspective, from a gospel perspective, some of the some of the doctrines, some of the beliefs that we hold true and that we hold dear to, as Latter-day Saints, has to do with this divine relationship of families, not just here in mortality, but carried on into the afterlife, carried on into our conception of heaven and what it means to be in these relationships hereafter, as what you termed as gods, essentially. And we are, as C.S. Lewis would put it, gods in embryo. Um, and this is kind of part of the crux of, I think, a lot of uh, theological disagreements we might have with various individuals from various denominations within Christianity, is our position on the ontology of God and man.
Right.
And when I was on my mission, I had a kind of an epiphany where I had talked to a number of people that week, and it didn't matter what we said or what scriptures we'd shared to make some sort of rhetorical point, um, and teach a particular topic. Nothing seemed to penetrate the hearts and minds of the people we were teaching. It just didn't. We were talking past each other all week long. Nothing seemed to gel. And so I had been pretty frustrated, and I had a moment where I realized that it all comes back to this. Uh, it all comes back to a fundamental difference in how we view who and what God is,
Right.
and his power of creation, and what creation actually looks like. If we, and this will kind of be the basis, I think, for our discussion maybe next time, when I have you.
No, you're right. It is of the utmost importance, because if God is of a completely different ontological order than we are, we can never be what he is, not truly anyway.
Right.
It's what I deal with in the final chapters of my third volume, Theosis. And the bottom line is that the reason that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is so pernicious is that it makes it impossible for there to be a coherent Christology, or for there to be any notion that God could truly make us what he is. And so at the end of the day, what Joseph Smith did in rejecting the doctrine of creation ex nihilo really opened the pathway to accomplish what he saw the purposes of life to be. The sealing power is really the centerpiece of our mortality. The learning experiences that we have, we'll have more than just here, but the bottom line is that the learning experiences are to make us fit to be gods. And when I say fit to be gods, I mean fit to be in the relationship of unity shared by the divine persons, so that we share their same glory, that we inherit everything that they are, that we know as they know, and we do as they do. And so this is a very profound sense of deification or theosis. And it's possible only if creation ex nihilo is rejected. And that's why it's so profoundly important.
Yeah, it really does boil down to these core fundamental doctrines.
It
Um,
does.
and something I learned as I was reading through the lectures on faith, um, is how eloquently Joseph and the other early church leaders had put together a coherent, um, a statement of theology, I guess, if we want to call it that,
What it is.
on these very issues.
Yeah.
And they did so in such a concise manner that it's very short. It and it cuts right to the chase.
Yeah.
I've become a quite a bit of a fan of the lectures on faith, the last few years, and I'm rereading them right now. And I'm doing so even here on the channel. I know that there are many people who have never read the lectures on faith, And so
Right.
I figured I would do so on the channel and just provide an audible version of the lectures on faith and kind of share some other scriptures or insights that kind of come to me as I'm studying through each lecture. Um, but I know that you're also kind of a fan of the lectures on faith as well.
The
I'm
seventh lecture is a masterpiece on deification and theosis.
yeah, and I view the lectures on faith. They all kind of build up. They build on one another. And you get to this seventh lecture, which I'm going to do next week. I just got to the sixth lecture, which is one of my favorites because it's kind of where the rubber meets the road, so to
Right.
speak. In discussing, how it is we exact or produce faith through sacrifice of our will to God's.
Mm-hmm.
And the seventh lecture, as you mentioned, is kind of the pinnacle, the culmination of all of these doctrinal points leads us to this conclusion. And I would say even I would include probably the King Follett discourse as probably like the honorary eighth lecture.
Well, it is, because if you notice how Joseph Smith begins the King Follett Discourse, he's actually giving us a commentary on the lectures on faith. Okay. He's talking about the character of God. Notice what he's doing. He's continuing the discussion in the lectures on faith.
Yeah, I almost wonder if he probably didn't, but I almost wonder if he kind of looked back at the lectures on faith from time to time and uh, learned some new things along the way through those later years of his life. I think it's pretty well known that he didn't write all seven lectures.
Right.
So of course he had to approve of them for publication. And this is what became essentially the doctrine portion of the Doctrine and Covenants. It was
Right.
essentially the doctrine and the revelations.
Right.
And I would assume that as he's receiving revelation line upon line into the last days of his life, he probably was able to look back at some of these earlier revelations and compare them with some other lectures that he and others had written as part of this work, and recognize how profound they were and could articulate in these later years just how profound they really are.
Yeah. I think that may well be what happened. It's very clear to me that in the King Follett Discourse and later in life, Joseph Smith is still reflecting on the lectures as they were written. But something very profound has also happened to him. He studied Hebrew, and it opened up an entire new world to him. And so he's now aware of the counsel of gods. He's aware of the differences in translation and then the limitations of prior translations. And he is so open. What's amazing about Joseph Smith is he's so open to learn about these things and incorporate them. And so we see kind of the culmination in the King Follett Discourse of that kind of thinking, based starting with the lectures on faith and the unity of the Godhead as the basis of theosis, and reflecting on the New Testament background of the counsel of gods and who we really are. And so if we understand God, we can understand ourselves. That's what he's teaching.
I being a fan of the lectures on faith, looking back at kind of what transpired that led to the lectures kind of being removed from the Doctrine and Covenants, is that something that you wish they hadn't been done? Do you wish that we still had them attached to the Doctrine and Covenants, or how do you feel about that? Because I kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, I'm like you. In some respects, it would be helpful if we had them in the Doctrine and Covenants, but we wouldn't want to be locked into them as doctrine at this point, right? Because in certain respects, they've been superseded. What's ironic is that the lecture that probably got him removed from the Doctrine and Covenants is really the only one that Joseph Smith probably himself wrote. That's the fifth lecture. Okay. And
Yeah, the nature of the Godhead.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is Joseph Smith is reflecting on DNC 193, Mosiah 14 through 16, and taking what's taught there and putting it together into a doctrine of God. It's very clear those are his source texts. And So the irony is that what Joseph Smith was thinking was unacceptable in terms of the Godhead, based upon what Joseph Smith was supposed to have known from his own first vision. Right? That there are two distinct beings, and the Father and the Son don't merely have a common mind in the Holy Ghost, that kind of thing. The reality is that um, Sidney Rigdon and his theology of the family had a very profound influence on the lectures on faith. And in part, I think it was the antipathy of Brigham Young towards Sidney Rigdon. Of course, he was an opponent, and I think that among other things influenced George Buchanan to kind of rethink the lectures on faith. So, and there was never, what bothers me the most is there was never any vote to remove them. They were accepted by common consent and simply removed. And then they had a new version of scripture. And I think the new version of scriptures was accepted by common consent, but I can't see anything showing that. But that would be the common thing that they would do. When the new revelation was added in 1978 regarding the priesthood, and they added the two visions, the vision of Joseph F. Smith and the vision of the Celestial Kingdom by Joseph Smith in 137 and 138 in the Doctrine and Covenants, there was a vote to accept it that way. So what we currently have has been accepted by common consent. And I think that's important, because what the scriptures actually are is a community coming together to say, this is what we deem to be foundational for us. This is what we adhere to. It's kind of like a constitution for us. Okay. This is definitive of who and what we are. And so what they're saying is the lectures are no longer definitive of who and what we are. We've superseded them in some respects. And I'm like you, I go back and forth. I think it would be instructive if we still had them. I can do without a complete genealogy of the long genealogy that we find in the lectures on faith. Noel Reynolds has written about why that's important, but it's never been that important to me.
Yeah, it was one of those moments as I'm reading through them on the channel that I'm just kind of like, my brain turns off a little bit, and you're just reading it to read it, and once you get through it, you're like, okay, take a glass of water, and now I can get back to something a little bit more stimulating.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's all good.
Do you think that there'll ever be something similar to the lectures on faith that will be accepted?
No.
I don't know. I've had this conversation before.
And LDS.
Yeah, and I I just don't see a way that that will happen. I think the
Yeah, I agree.
I think I don't know if you want to call them the intelligentsia of Latter-day Saint thought, those who are at the forefront of biblical scholarship and theology and all these various respects. I don't think that they could all come together and put together a cohesive theology that would be agreed upon to the extent necessary to bring forward to the common consent of the church.
I'm going to put it a little less charitably. I don't think that they have the background and capacity to appreciate a statement of theology. They don't have the people that would, like, they're people who are running, they're practical people. They're running a worldwide church, and they need leadership skills to, motivate people and keep the organization going, which is very essential. And it's important as well. I don't see anyone there that has the capacity to think theologically. Okay. I think they all do it to a certain extent, but none of them have the background and ability to really address these issues in a competent manner. And so I hope they don't.
Well, in some respects, with your own works, you've put together a series of theological works with the more Exploring Mormon Thought series. And so in some respects, you've provided many people the opportunity to study theology in a more serious manner without necessarily being tethered to it.
Right. It's important that it remains kind of a spur for additional thought and consideration, and doesn't become kind of a fixed dogma. because no philosophy text should ever be this is the final word, right? And the problem, if you do what was done, you're kind of saying this is the final word. Scriptures are kind of the final word. Evangelicals certainly take scripture to be that way. And when we vote on something and say this is constitutional of who we are, Latter-day Saints are saying, well, for right now, this is constitutional of who we are. It could change, but it should be based on revelation and not upon really competent theologians.
And that was what was so foundational about the lectures on faith to begin with, is the fact that they are a theological work, trying to make sense of the revelations that had been given up to that point.
Right. And they themselves in the preface say, look, we're presenting this for your consideration. This is our way of thinking about it, and we're just giving it to you for your benefit. They're not dogmatic about it. So they saw it as something that could be helpful to think through. It was never meant to be a final word, as I see it. So at least the preface makes that very clear. So I have no problem. And if we've superseded them, that's great.
Yeah. And as you said, it should be done with revelation and in a means by which the church can accept them by common consent as fundamental doctrines by which we can actually tether ourselves to adhere to.
When churches interact with theology historically, they're much more likely to be anathematizing, saying this is blasphemy or is wrong, than to say we adopt this. Okay. So the way that churches interact with theology is simply to correct it or reject it, not to adopt it.
Well, we see the same pattern going on in the early church, the early Christian church. From the time of Christ and the apostles, we have a robust revelation or revelatory experience happening in the lives of those who are adopting Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah and as their Savior. And we have the apostles going out to essentially teach this gospel, teach the people, and establish these beliefs. But they're doing it by revelation, and they're doing it by the gifts of the Spirit. And then we have a period of time for many hundreds of years after, where some of the brightest minds in the world are coming together, adopting these beliefs and trying to make sense of them theologically and philosophically speaking, in a more intelligent way than the simple fisherman down the street. And it's during this period of time, at least in my view, and I could be wrong, but it's during this period of time where some of the greatest minds in Christianity coming together to debate and argue and discuss these theological positions, that we start to see some much more ironed out, organized, and even dogmatic views come into play. That eventually became kind of the stumbling block to the everyday lay believer.
I think what happened is when the beliefs became politically divisive, you then see political authorities stepping in to systematize and settle disputes so that they can continue to control and reign without a division. That's certainly what happened with Constantine when he convened councils. And what's really happening is they've got to avoid schism, and that will maintain the power of the ruler in a sense. So there's always this need to avoid schism with the way people see things, and
it's sort of a compelled unity.
Exactly, it's a compelled view. The Arians, of course, lost that battle, and the Athanasians won the initial battles. And the creeds is the ossifying of various views that haven't aged very well, if I may. And so theology is simply the attempt to make sense of one's own religious beliefs in the culture in which they exist. That's all it is. And if it's done well, it's done with the full recognition of of the history of thought with an understanding of logic and the various kinds of arguments that work and have been given, and to see if there are additional ways to open avenues. And it can be done through argumentation, and the best that we can do, dealing with our own texts foundationally. And so, theology is a very involved endeavor that brings together a number of things. But at the end of the day, all I'm really saying is, given where I am as I find myself, my culture, how do I make sense of this? That's really all it is.
Yeah, and as we look at the church today, with new revelation comes greater insight, and sometimes that means our theology needs to be updated, to
Well, we
make
don't have a
sense.
theology. I mean, there's no official theology. They're really, I mean, you're not going to find anything like in Protestantism where you kind of begin in your break off. You have a number of synods or councils, and you come out with written statements about your confession, and this is what we believe. Your 13 articles of faith, I suppose. Okay, but they're very theologically informed and reflect the kinds of theological debates that they're having, and why the schism has occurred from the Catholic Church, or why the various schisms in Protestantism with different, factions in Protestantism, and how this is what we hold to. And so, that kind of thing has really stopped happening. Um, and I suspect in the future, Christians will be much more united because Christianity in general is now under attack, and it doesn't have the kind of power and control that it once did. So the way that it deals, the kinds of issues that it will have and the kinds of ways that it will deal with those issues will be very different.
You mean to tell me that in the future we're not going to have theological debates about whether dancing is sinful?
Um, no, I don't think we'll have those kinds of debates. I think we're going to have debates about what is sin, and we'll have debates about we'll always have debates about whether certain kinds of conduct are acceptable. Okay. Um, because any group has to have something that identifies it as what it is. And if we want to talk about identity markers, this is who we are. So, for instance, the word of wisdom has worked as an identity marker for Latter-day Saints. It's also been extremely helpful. Okay. But it works as an identity marker. And it kind of denigrates what it is to say it's merely an identity marker, because it's more than that. It's also a part of the identity of the people who embrace it. I Being a person who's never tasted alcohol, never smoked, never taken drugs is a part of who I am because of what I am. But the reality is I've never had alcohol because my maternal grandfather and uncles were alcoholics, and I could see the damage that came through drinking. I was aware that smoking was bad for you and stupid because it would destroy your health. And I've seen what happened with drugs from friends who took drugs, and I always thought, why would I do that to myself? So, it's a part of who I am, but it's also, I've been extremely blessed from it. My heart goes out to those who struggle from those kinds of things because they're addictive. And, but in the future, there will continue to be debates about identity markers. But I think that identity will be drawn more broadly because we're kind of all in this together as Christianity recedes from being the dominant force in our culture to one that is denigrated largely and under attack. The kinds of approach that Christians have, I suspect it will cause us to band together, okay, in a way that we haven't before. So we'll see. We'll see if I'm right.
Well, we're hoping. I have a number of friends who are of various different religious backgrounds, many of them Protestant. Um, and some of the things they argue about seem quite silly to me. Um, they're if you got them in a room together, they would battle it out as if they were talking about some of the most important things in their view, and really it's not. But when it comes down to it, we are all in this together. I, I I don't see how we make it through the culture battles, the culture war, unscathed if we're not willing to partner up and sort of band together And that's going to take um, a lot of charity all around.
Yeah, we've already been scathed. We won't make it through unscathed because we've been scathed, whatever that means. I don't know if there's such a verb as scathed, but if we can be unscathed, it seems like we should be able to be scathed. In any event, the there have been major hits that have been taken by Christianity in general and Mormonism in particular. Mormons are less popular than just about any religion that there is. We're lulled by evangelicals and atheists alike, and so Catholics are not too fond of us either. We're definitely a minority. Um, but, like I said, I don't care what other people think, so it doesn't really matter. And the bottom line is that we've got to really work together because our shared treasure is Christ. He's not our shared battleground. He's our shared treasure. And the sooner we realize that, I think the better that we'll do.
Yeah, and this goes back to something we were talking about earlier with the decline, not just in the numbers of those who identify as Christian in the West, but also a decline in an interest in serious scholarship and serious study of Christianity and theology and philosophy and a number of these fields. And I don't see how we can learn to band together unless we can also learn to take a greater interest in these areas.
I agree. I think so. For instance, the Latter-day Saint affinity for C.S. Lewis is instructive. I think the Latter-day Saint, affinity for things that the Greek and other Orthodox churches teach, I think, is instructive. The problem is that as long as we're battling each other for converts, that kind of animosity will remain. As long as people are changing from being identified from us to them, there will be this kind of a battleground, and there will be a certain kind of animosity. And it's understandable. It's kind of a tribal warfare when we get right down to it. But there are important issues. And, I think when it comes right down to it, however, we're going to see that we share a lot more than divides us. I'm convinced that that's the case, and I think that we'll see a lot more. And I think we've seen it in the past 50 years. We've seen a lot more of Latter-day Saints working with other religious traditions and organizations in a way that I think is mutually beneficial, and a lot more of that is going to happen. So.
I remember hearing about President Hinckley working together with the Catholic Church and other religious groups, and feeling like that was something revolutionary. That was something so
Right.
beyond what I thought would even happen, and even to the extent that I had felt growing up that we were kind of this separate little island of believers, and we were almost, in some respects, kind of untouchable. We're just kind of off on this little island somewhere. Nobody wanted to even touch us with a 10-foot pole, and so that's fine because now we get to believe whatever we want, and we don't have to worry what anybody thinks. But now we have President Hinckley reaching out and grabbing the pole and pulling us to shore with these other groups, and now we're working together.
And I think the outreach by President Nelson to the NAACP and other organizations such that in the past may have had a great deal of antipathy toward us. I think a lot more of that is going to be happening. Certainly the partnership between the LDS Church and Catholic Charities. Catholic Charities has a much greater reach than we would otherwise have. And we have resources that are really amazing because we're really good at certain things. We're really good at creating community, and we're darn good at investment. And so, we've created the ability now to where we have enough funds that we can do some incredible good in the world. And Catholic Charity sees that and is willing to work with us in a way to better the world and address the needs that people have through charitable outreach and other kinds of outreaches. So, as I see it, the cooperation is only going to increase, and we'll begin to appreciate each other a great deal more than we have. But I think that others will still see Mormons as outliers and weirdos. So
Sure. And even within the church, I know a number of people who are very hesitant to um to see the outreach that's going on with, let's say, the NAACP or Catholic Charities or a number of other things as anything other than just a superficial attempt to get the world to like us. And their
we're
outreach,
capitulating. We're
right.
capitulating there, and that's not what it is. In order to achieve what we see our goal to be in Christ, requires us to work with them in this way and to appreciate the shared faith that we have. Um, Faith in Christ is a universal principle that is eternally valid, and it doesn't matter who has faith; it's a valid faith, and it works for everybody. Okay, to the extent that they have faith, and so we shouldn't see Christ and our scriptural texts as a common battleground. They're shared treasure, and to the extent we share this treasure, um, let's revel in it together. And we're going to need each other a lot more in the future than we have in the past.
Yeah, I agreed. I'm hoping to see some more of that throughout my lifetime. Um, more outreached hands with various groups that serving my mission in Southern California. There's many Protestants and many atheists, and not a whole lot of them liked each other, and not a whole lot of them liked us. And um, I used to get back to the apartment at night and just feel drained from the day and wishing that there could be a little bit more charity in how we view each other, and seeing President Nelson kind of take the lead on a number of these uh, interactions and outreaching has been, I think, really important to see in the public.
His most recent talk on kindness in our actions on social media, I thought was epic. It's really needed. And that really is kind of that's the public square now. It's where, communication takes place. And what he's just saying is, look, it doesn't matter where you are. Kindness is always the answer. It doesn't matter what the problem is. Love is always the healing balm that will solve the problem. And so that's what we've been called to. And in the future, it's going to be different because, as I said, the Christianity is no longer the controlling regime. And that will result in a very different attitude toward those that are in control, and toward others, because it's no longer obvious that Christianity is true as it was during the time of Thomas Aquinas, for instance. It's no longer the case that a non-Christian can't be elected. It's no longer the case that Christianity is the dominant force in the culture. And my understanding is that in England, for instance, only about 5% of English people self-identify as Christian or active Christian. And so, we're in a very, very different landscape than we were even just 50 years ago.
That's a pretty scary statistic. I hadn't heard that before. I knew it was pretty low, but 5% is significantly lower than.
My guess is the polls will show it differently. I was talking to a religion teacher over there, and he said the reality is only about 5% actually identify this way, regardless. And so I was thinking, wow, that is scary. That's way low. I'd have to look at the actual data. There may be polls that show something different depending on how they ask the question. But when the question was put straight out, do you accept Christ as your savior? About 5% said yes. But that's a particularly English and Protestant way of putting it is.
Sure. I don't know that. I don't even know that Latter Day Saints would present that question in that way.
No, we wouldn't put the question that way. We would ask, do you self-identify as Christian for whatever you mean by Christian?
Well, listen, I appreciate you coming on and chatting with me. It's been a lot of fun.
Uh, Thank
really
you.
appreciate you taking the time.
I'm happy to do it.
I know there's a lot of things that we could have talked about tonight, but I'm actually really pleased with the discussion that we've had, and I think we've touched on a number of issues and topics that I think might be beneficial for a number of listeners.